Welcome to the White Rabbit Chronicles. To those of you who've listened to our prior podcast, welcome again. I, of course, am Angel, and here with me today is my most gracious co host, Dante.
Hello, everybody.
Today, we're going to be going down some very interesting rabbit holes for you. The first subject that we're going to dive into will be a little bit of a freestyle style of speaking, less scripted and more flowing. And we'll see if this just comes off better in the podcast format. We're going to be talking about Super Soldiers, which is a very interesting program. And during the second part of the show, if we do have time, we're going to be speaking a little bit about paranormal parasites. And that'll also be a very interesting rabbit hole. But we're going to start it off first with the Super Soldiers. Dante.
Um, I did high-level security for the Air Force in the early '80s, and while I was in South Korea at the time. I got a book. I got the book on the Bourne Identity, and I was already trying to figure out my career path with the skills that I had. I did a lot of martial arts training before the military, and then did some. You're doing some. You're learning to be a professional killer by the military, and the concept of these MK Ultra assassins, doing wet work as they call it for the CIA's Black Ops was something that interested me. And then I read that book and a couple other books, kind of relevant to the concept, and I decided that I didn't want to be a mind controlled assassin. I decided that wasn't the life path that I really came here to do and to be. Um, uh, but there are super soldiers. They've been trying to create them, well, actually for you know since at least the 30s with the Nazis in particular. They've done a lot of research, horrific research, um, and ultimately, once we part of the plan is once we become a global community, our off-world, um, some of the things that we're going to do off-world is going to be supplying armies of super soldiers to perhaps factions out, in the solar system and the galaxy. Um, I recently listened to a podcast on Project Camelot. Kudos to Carrie Cassidy. Uh, it's probably a couple years old, I think. Um, Two guys, Michael Prince and Max Spears. Max Spears has since died, mysteriously, of course. Um, but it was an interesting, it started out real interesting. Michael Prince at the beginning says, I was involved in operations for the Fourth Reich. You heard that right, Fourth Reich. For those of you who don't know, who haven't done any research, the Nazis did not lose World War II. The Fourth Reich, or the Third Reich, survived and has now become the Fourth Reich. Um, the Germany lost the war, and some people signed a treaty for Germany, but the Nazis did not sign anything. Okay, they just left the area and relocated.
That's really interesting because I remember the many reports, including Operation Paperclip, where they snuck all these high level Nazi rocket scientists, biological weapons experts, not just from Germany, but also from Japan, and they sneaked them into the US. The Vatican issued them passports, and they went through different countries in South America and eventually ended up in the US. And if you see old pictures of the first space missions, the Apollo missions, the moon landings, there is a very famous Nazi rocket scientist in that photo who worked on I want to say the V1 or
Me too.
V2, I'm sorry, the V2 rocket for the Nazis. This is a There's no way around it. This was a war criminal, and he's still around. I mean, their ideas are still around. And there's also stories in South America about Joseph Mengele going down to Argentina specifically and continuing his medical experimentation. The Nazis bought gigantic tracts of land in Argentina, settled, and there are places in Argentina that are mimics of Germany.
They gave him an island, and if I'm not mistaken, the story, the island of Dr. Moreau, is based on Dr. Mengele's island.
So, right now, what you're saying about the Fourth Reich is absolutely true. They were able to sneak many of their top level people, maybe not all the rank and file, but the Gestapo guys, the people that were in all of their highest level weapons programs, the intelligence, whoever the Mossad couldn't get their hands on, snuck out and they survived to this day.
Estimates of like 50 or 60,000 special forces troops.
And when I say survive to this day, I don't mean that the actual World War II Nazis are still alive, although there are rumors that some of their longevity experiments
Yes.
actually worked.
Yep. Yep.
And
I actually heard that Dr. Mengele is still alive. He
yes,
went by Dr. Green for a while, but now he's got a different name. In fact, Michael Prince says his latest name he heard was Steve Rabel, Rabel. Yeah,
interesting.
yeah, he's still alive. Goes by the name of Steve Rabel. He looks like a guy in his 50s.
So if anyone's interested in the current state of the Fourth Reich, there's a lot available online.
Hopefully, I just outed this uh,
POS.
criminal,
Yeah,
arch criminal.
we have to keep the language clean for YouTube, right? But do your own research on this. There was even a recent special on TV where they were looking for these towns and villages in Argentina that are essentially German towns. Everyone there looks the same.
Elie Wiesel, famous Nazi, Jewish Nazi hunter. Amazing story. Um, yeah, so interestingly, this guy says there's a Fourth Reich faction in America, also in England,
Hmm.
and then there's a kind of Zionist faction. So interestingly, the Fourth Reich faction is on the west dominates the west coast of America, and the Zionist faction dominates the east coast.
Interesting.
Especially obviously probably like New York and Philadelphia, where there's a very high concentration of Jewish people.
I didn't know that they were still duking it out all these years later after the war. But it makes sense. I mean, if you think about it, and I know we're going way off topic here, but I
It's okay.
digress. Uh, there's been as far as Zionism, as far as the Jewish people are concerned, it's been a historical issue where they've been persecuted and chased out of pretty much every single country in which they've settled, and it almost seems like looking at it historically that the culmination of or an actual formalization of the battle against Zionism, against the Jewish people, was really formalized during World War II when the Nazis, pretty much out and out said, you know what, we're going to get rid of all of the Zionists, all of the Jews. It turned into a real battle. It turned into one-sided battle where they were gassing the Jews in mass. But it was the first time that in living history where they had formalized the battle and said it's out in the open now. This is a faction and this is a faction, and since we're in power, we're now going to exterminate this other faction. And the Nazis were very good at what they did. They were very efficient. They were very German about how they approached it. But despite the death camps, despite everything that they did, they were not able to wipe out the Jewish people. They were not able to quote unquote defeat Zionism, which was ostensibly what their goal was. And I don't see why it's impossible to believe that the battle between these two factions is still going on today. Maybe on different levels, maybe the actors have different names, maybe the organizations have changed names, maybe the country where the battle is happening has changed. but the battle still rages on. It wouldn't surprise me at all if there's a current battle brewing in the United States between these two factions. Both sides are still at it, even even this late.
Well, I would guess that the West Coast faction is more leftist right now,
Yeah,
dominated, by California being the dominant state in this side of the country. Um, but Trump, I would guess, would be on the Zionist faction side. I guess.
wasn't Trump's family name originally a Jewish surname?
Uh,
Didn't he change the name, shorten it to Trump? It was Trump Felter. There
I
was a
have not
rumor.
heard that one.
Okay,
I know he's related to Danish royalty
okay,
because every president's related to royalty.
somehow, yeah,
Yeah,
that's not surprising.
yeah. I mean, it's king and president ultimately are the same kind of job. Okay, we don't look at it the same way because we think, we elect, but they're selected. They select, a couple of choices, but it's still their selections. They own both sides, and they're financing both sides.
I think Ralph Nader put it best when he said that when you vote for either Republican or Democrat, it's like voting for Tweedledee or Tweedledum. It doesn't matter.
It's still the Tweedle family.
Yeah, vote Democrat, vote Republican, matters not. You're still going to get the same result at the end of the day. Wake up, America.
One of these guys talked about there's been a recent peace treaty between these two factions. They're two sides of the New World Order agenda. So they both have the similar agenda. Uh, they're probably just fighting over who's going to be the dominant faction is what it comes down to.
The sad thing is that, honestly, if this is a war that's been going on for, say, hundreds of years, really the only thing that would ever bring these two sides together would be an existential threat from a third party. Maybe extraterrestrial, who knows?
I think they are the extraterrestrial factions that are fighting over who's going to dominate the humans. But, maybe that's just my crazy conspiracy theory.
Maybe that's a story for another show, right?
Yeah, that's a conspiracy theory for another day. So I highlighted this. Essentially, I'm working as an assassin. Assassin, excuse me. I was contacted by a corporation called Keypoint. They also used to be known as Kroll, Kroll. If people do the research, they're basically known as an assassination squad.
Hmm.
So the MK Ultra program, the goal was to create uh, super slow soldiers slash uh, sex slave slash messenger. So they would either carry messages, or they would be an assassin, or they would be a sex slave.
Huh.
That's the conditioning. And they used all the super soldiers are conditioned through pedophilia. Most of them are brought up. They're in their own family. You know, um, Papa Bush, George H.W. Bush, is said to have been the latest, the Führer of the Fourth Reich up until his death. He was, of course, became a CIA director. I think it was 75 or 76, supposedly with no intelligence background because he claimed he had never been in the CIA before. However, more recent developments show that he was probably in the CIA ever since at least 1959, when his company, Zapata Oil, became a CIA front.
Interesting.
Yeah. I have a friend who used to drive cocaine shipments from southern Texas, from off Corpus Christi, or near Corpus Christi. He would pick up shipments that would be come in by chopper off of the oil rigs that were offshore. And what was funny was the first time he told me about this story, and he's talked about how he used to drive shipments either to Florida or California, and he named the company Zapata Oil, and he had no idea who owned or operated that business, but it clicked for me right away. It's like, oh, the Bush is running cocaine off of their oil rig from southern Texas.
Reminds me a little bit of the operation that the Clintons had when they were in Arkansas. There was a very famous documentary about this. That when he was governor there, he was allowing flights of, I want to say cocaine or cocaine and methamphetamine, right through Arkansas, and they were running a little bit of a side business. That's one of the ways that their family made a ton of money while poisoning people with these drugs. So it's not out of the I hate to say this, but it's not out of the ordinary to hear these stories about the government being involved in drug programs. We go back to the CIA Contra program. They were running drugs in order to fund the Contras down in Central America, and nobody would believe, oh, the government would never do something like run drugs. Well, they did. It came out. They couldn't get normal congressional funding for the little private army in Central America, so they decided to run crack cocaine into the inner cities. I know of people that were witnesses to this particular program. I've also known of people who told me that they used to live in Oakland and in some of the inner cities in Southern California or in Northern California and Los Angeles also, where they saw boxcars, train boxcars, filled with weapons and ammunition that were just left open. That it wasn't a coincidence that the gangbangers during the 80s had access to essentially military equipment, that they got their hands on it because someone left it there for them. And I know of people who said, yes, we saw this, it was there. This is how they got their weapons. It was not by accident.
Well, I mean, it happened again during the Obama reign with the Fast and Furious scandal. A lot of people don't, think that Obama had a scandal-free presidency. That's crap. They just don't know what happened under him. But yeah, they were trading, they were selling weapons to gangbangers so that they could try to track where they went. And one of the big problems was that all of a sudden they were using, military hardware, automatic weapons to fight against uh, the friendly forces, so to speak. A DEA agent was killed with weapons that, we gave them.
And I still hear of recent cases where they bust drug lords down in Mexico and they find weapons that were stolen from U.S. armories, quote unquote, stolen.
I was going to say, quote unquote, stolen.
Yeah, right. So if anyone has any doubt, look up Operation Fast and Furious. Look up the history of the Iran Contra drug running scheme through the CIA, and look up CIA inner city weapons. Do Google searches on that, and you'll come up with some very interesting information, and more likely than not, end up on somebody's list. Sorry. I know, sometimes you just gotta laugh.
Okay, so Spire said they're playing out end time scenarios. So what they're doing is they're reading biblical prophecy, and then they're trying to create events that will fit into that prophecy, so that they can point to it and say, "See, it's God's will that you know 100 million people just got killed or whatever."
I've heard about this. There was news stories that I was reading that were very interesting, and essentially the way it plays out is that there's a faction within Christianity. There are certain denominations, certain churches that preach that the end times is something that needs to be kind of pushed along. It needs to be initiated. And what they were doing is they were supporting the activities of the Israeli government because they wanted to see a showdown between Israel and the Palestinians. They want to see the war because in their minds, according to their interpretation of the Bible, the war between the Israelis and the Palestinians, the Jew versus the Muslim, will be the initiating event for the end times. That'll be the final battle. So they've been doing everything that they can to get these two sides to fight, and while pretending to be supporters of Israel, it's sick. It's really sick, and they truly believe that if we can bring the end times, Jesus is coming back. He's coming back, but we need to create the end times. And I don't even know why I went into a southern accent right now.
Have you heard of Shabbatai Zvi or Zevi?
No, no, no.
Okay, he was a 17th century Jewish uh, guy that claimed to be a Messiah, and he developed a tremendous following. Like over 1 million Jewish followers, were believed he was the Messiah. Well, um, he believed that he didn't believe in guilt. He believed that you should do, whatever you do and enjoy it guilt free, no matter what it was, including any type of, you know, horrible thing. Uh, he was basically forced by a sultan, Arab sultan, to choose between death or converting to Islam.
Okay.
Well, he could have been a martyr and been, claimed to be Messiah, and he was martyred. And nope, that I want to live. He chose Islam, so a lot of his followers were, shall we say, a bit disappointed.
To say the least.
However, that group, if you want to look up Sabbatean Frankism, it's related to Shabbatai Zevi and Jacob Frank. This movement believes it's a it's a movement within Judaism still to this day that believes that in order to trigger the event, in order to get the Messiah to come, we have to get the world to a place where it's the most evil it could possibly be in order to bring it back into balance. So they're trying to uh, uh, push the balance as far, I don't want to say left, but as far to the evil side uh, in order to trigger the event that will bring the Messiah into being.
It's interesting. His philosophy sounds very similar, eerily similar actually, to something called the Luciferian doctrine, which pretty much says,
It's it. It's the same thing. Same people.
"Do what thou wilt,"
Yep.
as
Same people.
Mr. Holy Crowley said so many years ago, right? "Do what thou wilt shall be the letter of the law." So essentially, it's a hedonistic free for all. Do whatever you want. Do it guilt free. Do it 100%.
Um, in a way, I don't. It differentiates from, say, Wicca in a sense that they have a little preamble to that statement. Though it hurt none, do what thou wilt, and it's that caveat to me that the Luciferians are missing.
Right.
Okay.
Well, that's an important disclaimer. I mean, without that disclaimer, you could
Yeah, and it cuts out the all the
go around,
pedivore stuff.
kick a puppy, punch old people. I mean, there's no limit to what you could get away with and still be quote unquote holy within the doctrine. And there's some sick people. And actually, when you mentioned these experiments, the sex slave component of the super soldiers, I immediately thought of Epstein, the Epstein case, where he was going around the world with his associates and grooming children to be sex slaves, and then turning around and using these sex slaves to ensnare high level people, billionaires, celebrities, diplomats, high level government officials, by taping them having sexual relations with underage children.
Not just sex. Some of them were murdering and eating them.
Sounds very much like something that the Marquis de Sade wrote about in Salo, or the movie, Salo, which was essentially a bunch of Nazis holed up in an Italian villa up in the Alps, and they kill people because they get to the point where normal sexual pleasure is not enough for them anymore. And they have to keep turning up the volume, turning up the perversion, and the end goal was death.
Um, Hitler's introduction into high level society that basically led him to where he went was done by a black magician called Dietrich Eckhart. And one of the things that Eckhart did was to train Hitler in extreme, Luciferian ritual. And one of those rituals I've heard was one in where you dedicate yourself to a demon,
Hmm.
and you have to puncture your scrotum.
Wow.
Yeah, as part of the ritual process. And supposedly, after he did that, he couldn't go back to like regular, who's on top sex.
Right.
He had to start doing freaky stuff. That's why, he had to have special people like Eva Braun. You know,
Very special people. It's so interesting that you mentioned that part about penetrating the scrotum because I remember when I studied or did a little bit of study in history, we studied the history of the Aztecs, and within the Aztecs, they had a group of people that would hurt themselves using the spines of a cactus. And one of their practices, if I recall correctly, they would push spines through their cheek and they would also push it through their penis and scrotum as a sign of devotion and sacrifice to their god. And I don't remember if it was an offering to Huitzilopochtli or Quetzalcoatl, one of their major deities, or maybe a minor deity. But what stood out to me is this blood sacrifice was so prevalent. There was a power in blood, so the ancient people were very hip to bloodletting and blood sacrifice, particularly, well, I don't want to say only, but it was very well documented what happened in Mesoamerica during those times, pre-Columbian times. So the fact that Hitler had undergone a similar procedure, a similar ceremony, isn't very surprising. And I know that many people don't realize how steeped in occult thought, in occult ideas, ideologies, and practices the Nazi Party really was. The symbology that they used was absolutely occult. Even the swastika was a symbol that they stole from India, if I'm not mistaken. It was used.
global.
Yeah, it was a religious symbol, and they twisted it into something else.
The process of inversion is part of their religion, part of the Luciferian religion. So it's just like turning the pentagram, you know, point up to point down, so that it represents uh, negation, negativity,
Right.
and evil.
The almost like a black mass where everything is
Yeah.
turned upside down and read backwards. And here's the kicker: in Nazi Germany, they really did not allow normal religions to exist. It was the power of the state was absolute. And in Germany, the de facto state religion became a secular religion, which was Nazism, with the Fuhrer as essentially the godhead, and with the SS and his top men as the
The
top
priesthood.
acolyte, the priesthood. It was a secular religion. You worship Das Führer and his men, Goebbels, Himmler, uh, that was what you worship. You stuck your hand out and goose stepped, and were, if they snapped their fingers, you said, "How high, sir?" So I was reading an article and watching a video. Black Pigeon Speaks. This is a very interesting channel. He talked about how in current day times, with many more people turning to atheism as an answer to how they approach the universe, the mysteries of the universe is atheism. And a lot of people are thinking, well, millennials and current generation kids are embracing atheism. Yes, they are. But what they don't realize is that extreme leftist ideologies are beginning to come to the fore as a form of secularized religion, with blue checkmarked Twitter celebrities as their high priests and popes, bishops, and they have their own particular language. They have their catchphrases. They have their ideas, which are, they hold on to these ideas with a religious fervor.
And you can see it in the radical leftists, calling for, anybody who's a Trump supporter to be, I don't know, killed or whatever, beaten to death for being Nazis and racist. And then you have, the extreme right that's that's pushing their propaganda too.
It's kind of interesting. We're living in interesting times. They recently, the far left declared the Betsy Ross flag to be a hate symbol. They no longer want it flown at sporting events because it's a hate symbol now. And I'm thinking, really, guys, come on.
Well, my favorite story that just came out was Bernie Sanders, and I kind of like Bernie Sanders. He seems like a nice
He's a
guy.
decent guy,
He
yeah.
seems like a nice guy. But he's talking about how we should finance abortions globally in order to help the climate change issue. So abortions uh, to help climate change.
Here's my favorite quote. I so forgot the book where it came from, but it was a quote that I never forgot. It might have been a quote by Peter O'Rourke, where he said that fretting about overpopulation is a nice, polite way of being a racist. Think about it.
Yeah.
Margaret Sanger was very intentional where she set up her abortion operations,
Ooh,
and she was very, very out in the open when she talked about abortion rights and Planned Parenthood. She wasn't setting up those clinics in predominantly white neighborhoods. They were going into black neighborhoods. They were going into Latino neighborhoods. And she was very vocal about her eugenic ideas. She thought that the white people should be allowed to reproduce. They were a superior race, and that the blacks and other inferior races should be helped by easy access to abortion. I know that a lot of feminist activists hold her up as a hero. They erect statues in her honor. But even if you read her Wikipedia page, they downplay her violent racism, her violent adherence to the cult of eugenics. And those eugenicist ideas were some of the ideas that the Nazis paid very
close
close
attention
attention to.
to.
Yeah, Mankind Quarterly. I mean, they were looking at this kind of stuff.
You wanna read or listen to some hate speech? You go research that woman. Wow,
Yeah, there was
wow.
I saw a picture of her at some racist rally. I don't think it was the Ku Klux Klan, but it was bad. It was really bad because her ideas resonated with racists because she was. Sorry, feminists out there that want to support her. I believe that women have the right to choose and choose however they want to live their lives. It's not my purview to say, but I also believe that I have the right to call out your so-called heroes. She might have done some things that made lives better for women, but she was also a racist. And
And a eugenicist as well.
yeah, we if you want to embrace people, you have to embrace both their good and bad. Nobody's perfect. Even Martin Luther King. They just released the FBI, a lot of FBI information that had been classified for many years. The wiretaps, things that they had on him. He was living an interesting
He was a
life.
womanizer. He had
Yeah, he was
multiple
debauched,
multiple baby mamas.
cheating on his wife. The guy was out of control. But you know what? He did a lot of good. So I believe that it's very infantile to embrace only the good parts of your heroes and completely ignore the bad parts. As we become adults, when you're a little kid, your parents could do no wrong. They're perfect. They are the perfect human beings. And then you get a little bit older and you start noticing the defects. And then you get a little bit older and you gain the wisdom to embrace both their perfections and their imperfections. And that's in a very adult way to be, an adult way to think. So when I see people on the left and the right refusing to accept both sides of their heroes, both good and bad, it's like, come on, guys, let's grow up a little bit. Be real. Don't downplay the bad stuff just because it makes your person look a little bit less saintly. Embrace it all, then it's real.
Yeah.
So I know we've gone off to a ridiculous tangent. Oh God. But
Okay.
back to MK Ultra,
Okay.
I
I'm gonna pull us
believe.
back. I'm gonna pull us back to MK Ultra just a little bit. Okay. So one of the things that I found interesting was it mentioned a drug called scopolamine, and I saw this on a movie
Oh yeah.
recently, right? So scopolamine is used, quote, so much on us all, the CIA drug, but I've been given so much of it over years that I've become very resistant to it. It's kind of their main. chemical weapon in mind control because you're very compliant and you don't remember much afterwards.
Yes.
And he talked about a program called the IBIS program, and it was 42 boys that were raised as assassins from childhood.
Where did this happen?
Canada, actually, and many or all might have been related to George H.W. Bush. He was trying to spread his seed to as many people as possible.
Yeah, I remember that Vice did a documentary on scopolamine and its use in Colombia. Very interesting. So what they do in Colombia is that they'll blow scopolamine in the face of victims or they'll spike drinks. And this happens a lot to tourists. They get into the taxi driver blows scopolamine in their face, and then they drive them to the ATM machine and say,
Wow.
make a withdrawal. And if they're lucky, that's where it ends. If they're not so lucky, things get really bad. So think of scopolamine as almost like a Rohypnol, like a roofie, but it's almost a zombification drug. It makes you super compliant. You're almost like a zombie where whatever they tell you, it's go time. So as soon as you mentioned scopolamine, I thought, wow, that is it's real and it's really scary at the same time. So they had this program in Canada. What happened with that?
Well, Max Spears was part of that program,
Okay.
so they have missions. I mean, these factions are there's actually an off-planet war. Okay, there's an ET war going on. It's related to the reptilian species. Um, different governments apparently are making kind of agreements with different ET races.
Okay.
So there are certain, different factions are aligning with different, uh, you know, alien races. For example, the so-called white hats that are working with the U.S. military right now are a race of raptor beings that apparently look like a mini T-Rex. They average around 4 foot in height, but that's only because they kind of lean forward, but they're 8 foot in length. So from head to tail, they're 8 feet long, but they're only 4 foot tall.
So are these related to the reptilians?
They are, but they were a species that was indigenous to Earth.
Okay.
Um, uh, they left 65 million years ago when they had that one particular huge cataclysm. They eventually, well, that's an interesting story. Supposedly, they got stuck in a kind of a time dilation state. They either went into or got pulled into a black hole, and they just kind of like stayed in there and like suspended animation for like millions of years. And then they finally, broke out and eventually made it back here. At first, they were fighting against humans, but they have now aligned themselves with humans because their queen looked into the future and looked at different timelines
Hmm.
and decided that or found out that the timeline where they cooperated with the humans was the most successful.
Okay.
And so raptor beings have actually aligned themselves with humans against other reptilian backed humans. Like the Chinese, for example, are looked are apparently looked upon the reptoids that they're in league with that they're working with
Hmm.
are looked down upon by the Draco, which are like royalty to the reptoids.
Got it.
So there's this Draco reptoid bad grades because there's good and bad and everything, but Draco reptoid and the bad grays. This would be called the Luciferian Alliance,
Okay.
and so they're fighting against humans backed by raptor beings. And if it wasn't for the raptor beings, I think we'd be screwed, quite frankly.
Yeah. And if anyone's interested in just getting an alternate view of the timeline, Because really, the popular timeline that's been promoted by anthropologists and archaeologists is that there's been a linear progression where we started off as Neanderthal, and then before that, different levels of humanity, pre-humans, and that eventually we ended up as Homo sapiens sapiens. And there there is almost like a minority report. So not every single archaeologist toes the line that it's just been a linear progression. Essentially, in the popular mind, we went from monkey to man, and in between there was, some ape-like stages. But there are books like Forbidden Archaeology, and I believe it's Michael Cremo who wrote this book. And
Forbidden archaeology.
Forbidden, it's a classic, and in it they they really went into finds, anomalous archaeological finds, where they were looking at different artifacts that were buried in rock that was millions and millions and millions of years old. And these artifacts were clearly artificially made. They were handmade. There was no way that these artifacts could have been formed naturally. And I saw pictures of artifacts of objects that looked like airplanes, tools, old battery. There was a design for an old battery. Just incredible, incredible finds. But what's even more incredible about these is the fact that technically, according to the agreed upon trajectory of human evolution, they cannot exist. But there is an alternative theory. And the alternative theory goes that there were civilizations and species before ours. So instead of time being beginning to end, and we're just on one single timeline, the alternative hypothesis is that the time is more cyclical, meaning that there's been other civilizations before us that rose, and then through mistakes that they made or the misuse of technology and weapons, they essentially killed themselves off. They blew themselves up. And different there's different cultures, old cultures that believe in this, that it goes in cycles. Societies, civilizations rise, they hit a certain apex as far as their technological advancement. They do a lot of stupid things, they blow themselves back to the Stone Age, and then it's start over time. And then it happens again, rinse and repeat, which is why these different artifacts have been found where they just simply should not exist. And there are many detractors from this theory. That this could not possibly be the case. Where's the evidence? Well, there is some evidence, and there's even evidence that the Smithsonian Museum has actively suppressed any inquiry into these objects. So, in other words, anthropologists, archaeologists will go onto the field, they'll find anomalous objects, they'll send them to the Smithsonian where they are promptly cataloged and quote unquote lost to the ages. And if you go and ask for them, oh, they don't exist. And if you try to talk about them, they'll go after you. They'll sue you. They'll do anything in their power to try to prevent you from putting out an alternative hypothesis. And I don't know if it's just that they're afraid of being embarrassed, or they're afraid of their careers being ruined if an alternative hypothesis comes out, or it could be something a little bit more evil. Who knows?
There's a major off-planet agenda going on, and one of the things that's being done, like the transhumanism movement, is in part to create ultimately the mind-controlled human that they can use off-world to either fight battles as super soldiers, to maybe infiltrate, as well as for just plain old slaves and for food. So we are the intent is for us human beings to be supplied as those four categories.
There's a there are theories about that, and going back a little bit to the super soldier theories, I do know that one of the first major uses of amphetamines was in Germany. And not many people know that Germany was the creator of many of the drugs of abuse that we have now in this day. They helped synthesize morphine. They helped create most of the amphetamines in their current state. They helped with the LSD research. So a lot of the drugs of abuse originated in Germany and they were available over the counter in Germany. And
They
the
invented the crystal. They used to give their soldiers crystal meth in order to
yes,
turn them into quote unquote super
super
soldiers.
soldiers, yes. So they were giving them crystal meth. The US got hip to it. They were giving American soldiers meth to keep them going longer. This was very prevalent during the Vietnam War. They gave them drugs of endurance to keep them going. US Air Force pilots, they used to give them amphetamines until they ran into problems because they were going crazy essentially. There's something called amphetamine psychosis, and you've probably seen videos of people on crystal meth flipping out, running around in the street, almost getting hit by cars. And that's because of the psychosis, amongst other things. But I also remember reading that the reason that Germany developed all these drugs of addiction was very interesting. See, Germany didn't have a lot of places to grow herbs that were used in traditional medicines. So other parts of Europe had access to herbs, to different substances that were used for treating different ailments. So they became very good at creating drugs. And that was an industry that was heavily promoted in Germany. So when you hear Merck, you hear all these big companies, they were all originated in Germany because that was really where the pharmaceutical industry got its start, where it became a big deal was Germany. So a lot of the German population was hooked on heroin. Was I mean, it was well documented that Hitler was on a cocktail of amphetamines, heroin, different substances. He was almost up there with John F. Kennedy, who had his own little problems with addiction. So he essentially was a junkie. And that plays directly into the super soldier theory because those are the drugs that we know about, but there's other drugs that we might not know about.
I missed one category: genetics.
Interesting.
Other alien races are interested in our genetics.
I remember reading a story, and I don't have the link for it right now, but I remember reading a story that during World War II, one of the more outlandish experiments by Mengele was he was trying to interbreed humans with gorillas and other species in order to make a soldier that had the strength of the gorilla with the intellect of a human. Officially, officially, um, this didn't work for
Well,
obvious reasons, different species, but unofficially, there were some hybrids.
okay. Michael Prince mentioned regarding Obama, he's Egyptian royalty. He came from Nefertiti's child's DNA. He was definitely a created being.
Interesting.
And he does look a little, if you put his picture next to Akhenaten, he does look a little like Akhenaten.
That's very interesting.
So it'd
I was
be
not aware.
was Nefertiti was Akhenaten's wife,
So a lot of people are probably thinking,
one of them.
okay, hybrid animals, white rabbit, you're completely off the rails now. This is bullshit. Well, sorry, YouTube, but uh, here's something to think about. Recently, and this was also recently in the news, China pretty much admitted that using CRISPR, using genetic manipulation, they were now going to move forward with breeding animals that had hybrid portions of human DNA. Now, their reason for doing this is they're going to grow organs, human organs, inside of animals for transplants. And some people know this, some people don't, but organ harvesting or organ traffic is a huge industry in China. And it's also been known that the timing of a political prisoner's execution is sometimes eerily, eerily similar to the timing of the arrival of a wealthy U.S. resident that just happens to need a transplant. So what's happening is they're finding out that there is an underground for organ harvesting in China. You have the money, if you know the right people, they call ahead, you arrive on a certain date, The same day the political prisoner is put to death, their organs are harvested, and you get an organ transplant.
For those people who are sympathetic to the radical socialist movement that's going on, look at China to find out the agenda they're trying to push us into. They're trying to create turn America into a total fascist state where everything is controlled by the government and the elites. So, like you said, so if you're an elite, you've got money. That person over there is poor, but they're a match for you.
Right.
So they'll just they don't have they won't have to think twice. They kill them, give you their kidneys. That's it.
Yeah, so you can look this up. Look up Chinese organ harvesting. Use those keywords: Chinese organ harvesting controversy. And there have been news stories on it. There was a doctor, I want to say, that defected from one of the larger research hospitals in China and spoke about this. So there has been some buzz. It's not huge because a lot of this won't hit the mainstream media, but there have been stories about this where they're pretty much putting it out there, and that there's also talk that some hospitals in the US are hip to this. They know what's going on, and they're working with their Chinese counterparts to facilitate this organ harvesting that's going on. It's really
Well,
creepy.
it's they're harvesting everything.
Yeah,
Okay,
nothing is wasted.
every yeah they're harvesting everything. The whole system is actually set up as a harvesting program for them, and by them I mean off-planet entities
Hmm.
ultimately.
And the 1%.
Well,
Uh,
they are part of that. They are related to that. That's how they claim their right, their divine right to rule, royalty. Anybody who believes they're royalty, they believe that their divine right comes from their being more closely related to the ancient so-called gods, whoever they were, wherever they come from.
and the next step, I know you've talked about genetic manipulation and also the use of drugs, the use of brainwashing. For any of you who are not aware of MK Ultra, this is also widely disseminated. Most of it's declassified, not all of it. But it was a program that was run by the CIA where they were testing out different substances in order to create agents, assassins, and super soldiers. And the kind of the ironic reason that it came out was that they spiked the drinks of some CIA agents at a party without their knowledge. They spiked it with LSD, and one of them happened to jump out the window thinking he could fly, and their families sued. It's like this guy was never using drugs, and it slowly came out what was going on, that they were using drugs on their own people. So it it doesn't make it easier to go to bed at night thinking that, oh, our own government has used crazy drugs on us. If they're willing to use it on their own CIA assets, what are they willing to do with just the rank and file person?
Everybody, and I mean everybody who has any interest in this at all, should go out and get the book "Behold the Pale Horse" by William Cooper. He's got evidence there of experiments that our own government has done on our own people.
And now we're running almost up against the hour. I want to really briefly start, unless we have more on the
Well,
Super
let's
Soldier
just
program.
finish on this
Okay,
subject and just
let's write
cut
it
it
out.
short. Yeah.
Let's write it out.
So the last thing I wanted to get into was I was talking about genetics. You mentioned clones. These
Yes.
super soldiers mentioned clones, and this is the part that really stuck out to me is that um, when they make a clone, whatever they do to the clone, the original is going to experience.
I've heard of this.
And this is scary as heck. Okay, they just create a clone and they start, I don't know, burning it or torturing it or raping it, whatever, and you're going to have those experiences in some form. I don't know how it works. I'm just going by what I've heard from different sources.
Well, one of the things I remember reading about in studies with twins is that when they did study twins, one of the things that they ran into that was super interesting is that sometimes twins knew when the other twin had passed away or was undergoing an extreme pain. Sometimes they would even share thoughts, like almost like a form of telepathy between twins, and they were never sure how it worked.
Quantum entanglement.
Yeah, that's That's yeah, and we don't understand every single mode of communication out there, and quantum entanglement is another potential route of information transference. I mean, if two halves of the same particle can affect each other instantaneously, regardless of distance, who's to say that two twins can't share on some level or on some dimension a form of communication that actually works? But another thing that I remember that you mentioned about the clones knowing each other is, and let's think theoretically. So you make a clone. So you have two soldiers or four soldiers that are identical. In the old legends of the doppelganger, I don't know if you've heard of this. That the doppelganger was supposedly a paranormal entity that would attack people and would replace them. So it would make a duplicate of you. But the legend goes that if you ever met your doppelganger, so people would say, "Hey, I saw you at a certain place, and I've never been to that place," or "Hey, I saw you in this place at this time, like I was home at that time." So they would say that your doppelganger, your double goer, which is what it means, would be there first. And different cultures in Europe have this legend. So there was a part of the legend that said that if you ever met your doppelganger, you would have to one of you would have to die because two of you could not exist at the same time. So, just as a mind experiment, what would happen if they do make this perfectly matched genetic clone super soldier with superpowers? It's been genetically modified to be a killing machine with no remorse, and then it meets its other half. Things, at least in my mind, could either go very well and they would work very well together as a unit that thought this alike, or if they didn't do the work properly, things could go really, really badly.
Well, the one of the main aspects of these super soldiers going on through mind control is that they split their psyche, and so they have alters. They have alter personalities,
Gotcha.
and so whereas one personality will be a nice guy and care about kids
Hmm.
and love puppies and all that, you know,
And cats.
yeah, whatever. Um, uh, they can be triggered into absolute, cold-blooded, assassin or completely amiable, you know, sex slave, I guess, or slave slash sex slave.
Well, that's huge because during the Vietnam War, there was many stories of soldiers who, there's a war, and as wars tend to go, they support different types of economies because soldiers have money and they're very bored. So the classical thing in Vietnam was that there was a lot of brothels that would spring up around the bases, and the American soldiers were only too happy to visit these brothels. But there was also stories about the Vietnamese prostitutes doing certain things to themselves, like inserting razor blades inside of their bodies in order to harm U.S. soldiers, and also there's STDs and things like that. So unless the U.S. can find some type of a drug or other treatment to completely kill off a man's sex drive, they have to find some type of a solution to this. And creating a breed of super prostitutes, I mean, it's kind of weird to think about it, but from just a logistical and a strategic standpoint, keeping it all in house, that kind of makes sense. I mean, it's sad, but it makes sense. They don't have to go off base. That you can kind of keep it all under wraps and under
When I
control.
was when I was stationed in South Korea, when I arrived to Osan Air Base, we made friends with the guys that were getting ready to leave. We were the green. You're a green bean when you get there, so you have
Hmm.
your initial party. It's called the green bean, and we were given a map of 47 bars within walking distance from the main gate, within probably a mile and a half at the most. So there were 47 bars, and me and my friends, we went to every single one. And by the time we left, we found new ones. So there was actually within that year, we added 5 new bars to the map. So this was the legacy of called Songtan Oop is the name of this little town that basically sprung up feeding off a major U.S. military base.
Hmm.
Everything was
Hmm.
geared around that. The market, you know, I came back with half a dozen pairs of tennis shoes. I think They were all $1 or $2, except for Nikes were like $3 or $4.
Wow. Yeah, so it does support the local economies, and economies or businesses do spring up around these bases. So it really makes sense that the more that they can control, the more that they can keep in-house from just a logistical standpoint, it makes a lot of sense. But then again, I think it runs into some ethical questions. If you make a super soldier or you make a clone prostitute, a super soldier prostitute, does this thing have human rights? Does it have any rights at all, legal protections, or is it just a piece of like a robot, a human robot?
Well, I've heard that Britney Spears, for example, has had many clones, and uh, sadly, many perverse people have used her clones. That's crazy, dude.
That is nuts.
That is nuts.
That is nuts. So we have reached the end of the hour. We're going to save the topic of paranormal parasites for the next show, but I will leave you with this very interesting quote from the book. Just think about this way. When it comes to paranormal parasites, there are many things out there that view you as food.
Mm-hmm.
Hmm. So thanks again to all of our listeners. Thank you, Dante, for co-hosting and for sharing the information about the super soldiers and for sharing the personal stories. It always makes for a more compelling story when you have personal knowledge of the things that we're talking about. So we've experienced some of this, we've researched some of this, or we know people that know people.
Interacted with them, yeah.
Makes it a lot better. And remember, do your own research. Go on to Google, figure it out, or use alternative search engines such as DuckDuckGo, because we know about Google. They're not very nice. And we hope that you'll be with us for our next show. Again, thank you very much.
Uh, I dated at least two women that came out of this program that I didn't realize until afterwards. So we're gonna do eventually a show on that kind of stuff, a little more detail. Thank you for listening. God bless you all. Peace.
Thank you and peace.